Good afternoon again and welcome. So in today's session, it's going to run for about 40 to 45 minutes, depending on how quickly we can get through the content. But the idea of today's session is to bring to your attention how we can start making our Power Apps responsive. So that may be maybe something that you've been looking for a while. It may be something that has caught your interest and you're trying to understand what we mean by responsive design. So we're actually going to go through that entire process today. We're going to explain what responsive design is, as well as how we can go about setting apps up that are responsive. So I'm going to guide you through the process of how to set up a responsive design Power App, what we need to do to first action that, and then what items we'll need to worry about in terms of using those designs on our apps. We're then going to look at some of the new things that we're doing here at Combined Knowledge. So we've got some new courses, new exciting courses coming out, some updates to existing staple courses, as well as some of the new items that we've got coming in Training Plus. For those of you that do manage to stay around to the very end, we do also have the chance to win a £50 Amazon voucher as well. So there'll be a registration process for that at the end of the webinar, so stick around for that, and we'll get your names entered into a hat and we'll get it drawn out at random. Hopefully you are the lucky winner of that. So I think most people have managed to join into the session now, so we'll get started. So just a brief introduction as to who I am then. So my name is Simon Gray. I've been with Combined Knowledge now for coming up to about 2 years, 18 months, 2 years. So I specialise in the Power Platform training here at Combined Knowledge. Much to my manager Chris's dismay, he loves teaching the Power Platform as well. So we kind of wrestle between the two of us who's going to be taking that session when that comes up. But myself personally, I've been a web developer for about 10 years, as well as working in other IT sectors as well after that. And so that's really helped me kind of get a grip with Power Apps. Saying that, don't panic if you're not a developer or haven't had any developer experiences. One of the reasons why I like Power Apps so much is because of how easy and quick it is to get started. So it really does take a lot of the pain out. That doesn't mean that it's completely pain-free. We still do experience some painful moments, but hopefully with these webinars that we've got going on for you guys, you'll get through those a lot quicker. And then also we do a lot of training around Power Apps and the Power Platform as a whole. And again, we're always trying to get rid of those pain points for you with that. So just a little bit of my recent achievements there at the bottom. I've been lucky enough to take some of the Microsoft exams. So I'm a Microsoft certified trainer, as well as being certified in the Power Platform as both a functional consultant and an app maker as well. So hopefully you feel nice and safe there in our hands. So we're going to jump straight into this actual webinar then. We're going to assume that you know a little bit about Power Apps, but for those of you that are kind of new to the table, essentially Power Apps is a part of the Power Platform, and this Power Platform is essentially, it's really enhancing what we can do with our Microsoft 365 subscriptions. We can build Power Apps to quickly and easily interact with our built-in data sources like SharePoint and Excel online, and we can also then share those Power Apps out with our colleagues. Now that's the most important aspect that we need to be worrying about today. The data sources and where we're going to be storing our information are kind of irrelevant, which is a nice change of pace for what we usually deal with within our Power Apps scenarios. So the actual data source that we're going to be looking at is just a SharePoint list. I've actually grabbed it from one of our courses. So if you've been on one of our courses, you'll be fully familiar with the information that we're going to be using. However, it's just a standard SharePoint list that we've got loaded into our SharePoint environment. So let's just open that up quickly so you can have a look. So essentially I've got a SharePoint site called Security Setup, and in Security I simply have a visitor parking log list. And so the scenario behind this list is essentially what we're doing is we're passing this over to our security team, and we've got a very small car park, and As a result of having that small car park and having lots of visitors come to visit our site, what we're actually kind of doing is making sure that our visitors get their foot in the door. They're able to park in that very small car park that we've got at the very front of the building. But obviously, we get people from other businesses and other colleagues that are kind of chancing it. So our security guards need to know who is allowed to park and when they're allowed to park in this area. So up until recently, this was just an Excel spreadsheet, and we basically call down, register the registration for the car, the make and the model, just a little bit of background information, the date in which the visitor was going to be there, and then some contact information as well, just in case there was any problems. Now, all of this information is completely made up, and so we don't need to worry about phoning any of these telephone numbers. I don't think they work or anything like that, so don't be tempted to call any of those. But essentially what we wanted to do is make it easier for our security guards so that they had a live, up-to-date list in their hands at all times, as opposed to having to load it up on their computers, maybe print it off and then go out into the car park. Obviously that means that we can then also update that register much more easily. So we can actually build a solution so that the user themselves, when they come in to sign into the building, they can actually register their vehicle. And this is something that I've done at lots of different hotels and lots of different businesses from time to time when I've had to show up on site and I've had to register my vehicle, so again that they know. So not nice and simple scenario that we've got going there. Again, we're not really interested too much in this for our scenario. The data source is irrelevant when we're trying to talk about our responsive app. Now, what do we mean by a responsive app? Why do we keep referring to apps in that way? Well, essentially, when we do start building Powerapps, they come in only one or two different layouts. So we have the option to choose between a tablet layout and a phone layout, and that's quite restrictive. That means that we can we're basically optimizing our device, our app, for that single device. So if we start using our apps then on different devices, we're not going to have the best experience. We're not going to make use of that environment, that screen that we've got going on there. So typically Powerapps are optimized for our single device or layout, and then the app's layout will determine the size and shape of the canvas. That's where the term canvas app comes from, the actual canvas that we're going to be placing our controls onto the screen for creating our Powerapps. Now, out of the box, what we're actually able to choose, depending on the journey that we go through, we're actually able to choose both the layout, so we can choose between phone and a tablet. So typically between a very narrow phone layout and quite a wide but not so tall tablet layout. And then we can also choose the orientation. So again, we can choose if it's a portrait or a landscape for either of these layouts. Now, the problem with this, like I said, is if we try to use our apps on different devices, we're going to have a different experience. So typically what we'd have to have done in the past is maybe create two apps, two different apps that work with the same data source in exactly the same way, but the layout has been optimized for those different devices. So if we look at what our Powerapps will actually look like on a different or wrong device, so with the out-of-the-box options selected, if I try and use a mobile phone layout on a desktop computer or a tablet, essentially what I'm going to end up with is the same experience as a mobile phone user. I'm going to see the mobile phone layout of my app on the screen, and I'm going to get these two big grey sidebars that kind of accompany the app wherever I use this. So if I use it on a tablet, I'm going to see that. If I use it on Microsoft Teams or embedded on a SharePoint site, again I'm going to see this this kind of layout on my screen. Now, it doesn't mean I can't use the app. In fact, the app works in exactly the same way as it does on my mobile device. It just doesn't make best use of the screen. So there's lots of, in this case, excessive scrolling. And again, we're just using our visitor parking log list here. This is actually one of the pre-generated apps that we can build from within SharePoint. So from within SharePoint itself, just open that back up. At the top of our ribbon, we've got the Powerapps button, and as you can see, we've got a number of different options. But if we click on the Create an App button, this will actually start to generate an app for us for our Powerapps. And unfortunately, that only builds a mobile layout. So we're kind of stuck at that point on what direction we've gone in. So if we've gone directly to Powerapps itself, and from the Powerapps Create screen, I've then chosen to create a canvas app from blank or from my data source, I can select the layout that I want to use. And this is obviously restricted to us when we create this via Powerapps. If I was to create an app now from this data source and give it a name, so just give it a quick name and click Create, this will then look at my data source. It will build the same familiar screens that we're used to seeing. And again, we're restricted to that mobile layout, that layout with the two sidebars. So just give that a couple of seconds for it to generate, and then we'll be able to preview that. So again, this is one of the key advantages for those of you not as familiar with Powerapps as maybe some of our other attendees today. I'm going to get an app that works. It allows me to update and edit and view and search my data source, my SharePoint list, from my mobile phone within a few minutes. So it's already quickly generated my app. If I press the preview button, which we're going to spend a lot of time pressing today, that's going to show you that my app has this, it's taken up that restricted layout. I'm not utilizing the full screen that I have available to me on my widescreen computer. Now, this is an advantage in this scenario, because obviously if I'm developing an app specifically for this phone layout, then I'm seeing it as that phone layout is going to see it as well. So it's not all doom and gloom, it's not all bad. This actually works quite well for a number of scenarios. But we're looking at those scenarios that it doesn't work for today. So let's close the preview down, and actually I don't really need this app. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to close this one off, and I'm just going to go back to my Powerapps home screen, because we're going to be spending a bit more time in our other areas. Let's close all these down. We don't need these ones. Fantastic. So earlier on, I actually created, there's my quick name one, I actually created a number of different apps to kind of show this off. So what I'm going to do is quickly bring across my mobile phone. It's sporting the new updated mobile Powerapps experience. You can switch this on from your Powerapps settings in the device. If you go into your, just at the top there, then at the bottom we've got the new design just down here, new design preview. So I do apologize if I click on the button without indicating where I'm clicking. Obviously I forget that you can't always see where my fingers are on the screen. So as you can see at the bottom, I've got all of my apps. In fact, if I do a quick refresh, we should see my new quick name app appear as well. And essentially, if I load up my quick name app, that is going to be exactly as I expect it to appear. Now, my device is actually using a slightly larger screen than that of the device that this is actually aimed at. So although I've got this nice snazzy kind of side view, kind of showing that it's a mobile device, I've got the exterior of the device to make it a little bit easier for you guys to see what's going on. I actually have quite a bit of wasted space just up here and just down there. So even this layout isn't optimized for my device. And that's where this responsive design is going to kind of come along and take away the pain for me in terms of not just my user experience, but also my app maker experience as well. So as a quick example, let's go back into let's go back over to our slides actually, because if I was to view then a tablet layout on my phone, I'd get a completely different experience as well. So typically what we're expecting from a tablet layout is a widescreen layout. We actually have a lot more control over the layout of our Power App, and so we've actually got one loaded up here. But let's find the tablet version just here. So if I click on this, it's actually going to open the app instead of letting me edit this app. And although I still have the annoying sidebars that kind of show me and highlight the wasted space on my screen, it's actually making better use of the widescreen experience that I've got on my desktop computer, as you guys can see. Now, what would happen if I was to show that on a mobile phone layout? So just as you see on the quick screenshot that we've got there, is exactly what's going to happen when we decide to view this on our mobile phone. So if I click on parking log tablet, aptly named so I can easily and quickly get to the right one. As you can see, although I can still interact with the app, it's a little bit smaller, and for you guys it's a bit blurry as well, because obviously everything's a bit smaller. Now I've got the aspect ratio kind of locked in as well, so what that means is it's not going to scale things to fit the screen. But I've also got the orientation locked on my my mobile device as well. So even though you guys can't see this, I've actually rotated the device 90 degrees, and it's not rotating that as well. So on the actual Powerapps settings for our Powerapp, if we go in and open these up, so if we go to File and then Settings, these settings are the same for every single Powerapp. Essentially what we have access to here is the orientation, how we are designing our app, its intended purpose. So we can set the default, but then we can also set the size. Now we can't set the size when we're setting a mobile phone layout. We only have the choice of its orientation, either landscape or portrait. Now again, typically we're going to be running our mobile devices, our phones, in portrait mode, because obviously that's the easiest way to hold a mobile device. Now down at the bottom we do have some additional options, and we'll come to these a little bit later on. But essentially we can also lock the orientation. So what this means is, even though myself, I might like to have my apps rotate as I rotate my my device, I might want to force it so that my users can't do that. Now there's a couple of reasons for doing that. One of those might be less work. If you have to worry about whether your users are rotating the device and having a slightly different experience, you're also going to need to test that as well. So if you're trying to get your app up and running as quickly as possible, then I definitely thoroughly recommend switching this off, just because that means you've only really got one app to develop. You've only got one app to build up. Once you're happy with it, once it's out there, once you've got all the little niggles ironed out, and you've got users happily using it, then you can look into switching the orientation lock off and allowing the users to decide which orientation they want the mobile device in. Now again, if you've not had many requests for this, it might be something that's put to the back of the list anyway. You've got more important things to come up with. But these advanced settings are going to be something that we use a lot later on when it comes to building our responsive Powerapps. So as you can see, depending on which Powerapp we've built and why we've built it and how we've decided to lay that out, will determine what experience our users are going to have within our Powerapp. So this is where in the past we'd have had to have developed multiple different apps. I'd have to have had an app for my my widescreen computer and then an app for my mobile phone. Now there isn't too much wrong with that, other than the work is obviously duplicated. So as a result, if I make changes to one, whether that's a small change or a substantial change, I'm then going to have to replicate that across to my other Powerapp as well. And this is where responsive design Powerapps really come in. So responsive design Powerapps basically mean that we only have one singular entity, one Powerapp that will work across multiple devices. This means that any updates I make to that singular app are then going to be available to every user that's using it, and it's going to give the most comprehensive experience to every user as well. So with my mobile phone being ever so slightly longer than the default mobile phone layout, I'm going to make better use of that screen size as well. This means that if we have users with unique devices for accessibility reasons or preferences, again, we don't need to worry about building an app just for those guys to use. This one singular central app is going to cater for all of those scenarios. So again, although there might be a little bit more work in setting up a responsive design app or converting an existing app to a responsive design, in the long run it's actually going to save us a lot of time and a lot of worry. So as you can see here, we've got the same, it's a website admittedly, but it's the same process. I used to do this back in my web design days, and it's just as simple, in fact probably a little bit simpler to do on a Power App than it was to do on a website, because we have to worry about frameworks and browser versions and things like that. Microsoft does all of that for us. We just need to worry about the settings that we're going to be using and how we're going to be facilitating those settings as well. So how do we get started in using our Power Apps? So remember those settings I was talking about just a few moments ago? That is where the process will actually begin. Now, depending on your Power Apps age, whether it's a new Power App that you're creating or if it is an existing, we'll call it legacy app, it might actually be relatively new, but it's one that's already out there in the wild, you're going to need to activate exactly the same settings. So there's a couple of settings we need to switch on. So from the settings menu, so you go File, Settings, under the Advanced Settings, initially we'll need to make sure that we have the layout containers switched on. So these layout containers are what are going to allow us to easily and quickly convert our app into a responsive Power App. Once we've got the layout containers switched on, admittedly this is a preview feature. This preview feature essentially means that, that there are still changes being made to these items. It's still being tested. However, it is close to being released into general availability. It's not necessarily switched on by default for every single app. So again, this is where if you have a slightly older app, you may actually need to switch this on. By default, for new apps, so if you just go over into my my new Power App that I created a few moments ago, my quick name one, if I quickly click on the edit button, when I go into the settings and then click on advanced settings, this is already going to be switched on. So if you go into file and then into settings and then advanced settings, I can cheat. I'm going to use the quick search box here at the top, and I'm just going to type in container. So here we've got layout containers. This is the option that we're after. This needs to be switched on. And again, if it's a new app, one that we've just created, all of these preview features are switched on by default. However, if it is an older legacy app, then you will need to switch this on as well. Now, if you are switching on new features for older apps, before you do anything else, make sure you do a save, not a publish, but then do a quick test. Just make sure that everything that is already in the app is still working as you expect it to. That's just recommended whenever switching any settings on or off. You want to make sure that a change that you're making isn't having an impact on existing functionality as it is. The last thing you want to do is switch this on, spend a few hours converting your app, and find out that actually the layout containers get in the way of some of the existing functionality that's already there. So if you ever are switching on any of these items that are switched off, always do a save and then make sure you do a quick test of your app as well. Now, the other option that we're going to need to be switched off is the screen size and orientation menu. We'll need to switch off scale to fit. Now, this is kind of the reverse to what you're expecting to happen. Obviously, we want our apps to move around. We want them to respond to what dimensions the screen has. So it sounds a little bit counterintuitive when I go to screen size and orientation to then switch off scale to fit. So it is also worth switching off lock orientation as well, although not necessarily critical. It just makes the setup a little bit easier. But yeah, scale to fit basically means it will try and make that app scale to fit within your device's screen size. So you're kind of thinking, well, isn't that surely something I need switched on with a responsive design app? Actually, no, it gets in the way a little bit here. So by disabling that completely, we have complete control over our apps. So let's just come out of that. We don't need this one open for now. So what that will do is that will basically mean that our app is ready to be converted into a responsive design. It actually gives us a few new options. So the new controls that were actually added into our Powerapps insert menu are the horizontal container and vertical container. Now the other container that we have there was actually there already anyway. So that container was basically a way of grouping items together and has no real impact over the actual layout of our controls. And essentially what we're going to do with these controls, the horizontal container and the vertical container, they are where we're going to now place our controls instead. So previously we would just put our controls onto our screens and off we go. However, what we need to do to interact with these controls, to make them responsive, to make them understand where they need to now be positioned on the screen, they need to go into this new container, which is what we activated in the advanced settings. What these controls will add is an additional set of properties for us to utilize. So we're going to spend a lot of time looking at these over this session, but essentially these properties are what we use to configure the layout of our controls. So we'll place our controls within these containers, and then we'll use these options to control how things look, and that is going to then affect the behavior and the experience that our users have of our mobile apps. We also have a set of new screen layouts as well. So when we press the new screen button, which we'll look at in a second, at the bottom we'll also have a set of predefined responsive screens that we can quickly set up and start using for creating a responsive screen layout. Now note that these are only available on the tablet layout, so we can't utilize these screen layouts on the mobile layout. So we can only use these if we've started our Power App with the tablet layout instead. So let's have a quick look at that in progress. So I've already got a responsive design app kind of already pre-set up. Now this is based upon the same SharePoint list we looked at a moment ago. So here I've got my car details for the car park, and essentially what I've built is a Power App that responds to the screen size. So notice that down the left and right hand side I don't have any space wasted, taken up by simply grey bars or another colour. Now we do have this control bar at the top. That is so we can get in and out of our testing experience. But essentially now what will happen as I change my screen size is that the app will actually respond to what's going on. So notice that the items are moving around and I don't have a side scroll bar. That's essentially what we're trying to achieve. We don't mind having the ability to scroll up and down. So as I use my mouse wheel or click and drag with the mouse, obviously this may be used with a finger as well on a mobile device. It's okay to have to scroll in one direction, one axis, but to then have to scroll in two makes things very difficult for us to find. And essentially by utilizing these containers, what I'm able to do is have one app that will respond to multiple devices. So again, if I open up my mobile phone and just bring that across, and what I'm going to do is open that up. So just down here at the bottom I've got my responsive app. I'm going to open that one up, and this is exactly the same app as that you're seeing behind the screen. And as you can see, it's got exactly the same options available. I can select my items from the gallery. I can view the information in more detail at the bottom of the screen. But this is the same app. And so it doesn't matter which device I'm using it on. Notice again at the top of the screen, I'm not having any of that wasted space. I'm using the most amount of space available to my device's screen. Now that is achieved by using some quite useful properties for our containers. So when we're creating and updating our apps to be responsive, there are a few things that we need to be aware of that we weren't necessarily aware of before. There are the height, width, X and Y properties of our controls. So when we're inserting our controls or moving our controls into our containers, we need to be a little bit aware of the actual height and width properties of our new controls or existing controls. What this will basically mean is we'll need to reference or look at other items to grab these values to calculate them for us. Now fortunately the the new container controls that we've got available to us actually do a lot of this work for us. We don't really need to do too much of this. But if ever something isn't behaving as you would expect it to, check out one of these properties. So the height and the width are obviously the dimensions of that control, and we'll look at a couple of examples of that in a second. But the X and Y properties, they're the position on the screen traditionally. However, when we're using them within context of our new containers, our responsive containers, they're actually the position within the container, not within the screen itself. A new property that's been added into Powerapps as well that makes this responsive design much easier for us to use and understand is a value called dot size. And essentially what we can do with this dot size value is we can check the size of our screen to see what type of device we're actually using for our Power App. So what we're essentially going to do is give our control a set of instructions, a set of properties, but what we can do is override those with a switch or an if statement, and essentially say if I am on a mobile screen, give a different screen size or a different font size, or even use a different color if you really wanted to as well. Essentially each one of those sizes references a type of device. So screen size dot small, which has a value of 1, is typically for a mobile phone layout, so very, very narrow layout. Screen size dot medium, or value 2, is a tablet being held vertically, so again much wider than a mobile phone, but still not as wide as, say, a laptop or a desktop computer screen. Then we've got the other orientation of our tablet, which is obviously horizontal, so we've got the wider aspect ratio going horizontally. This is referenced as dot large, and then dot extra large is our desktop computers, and we can use this property to check exactly what's going on within our app so that we know how to make things appear on the screen. We can also reference something called parent.height or .width. Now what this means is when we are placing our controls into our screens, essentially we're building a hierarchy. So this hierarchy allows us to reference the item that it belongs to or its parent. And when we start building using these containers, these responsive containers, obviously we're placing controls into those containers. And so as a result, we need to reference from time to time the height or width of that item that it's within, so that we get the right aesthetic, the right presentation of our control. And we can do that with parent.height or parent.width. And then the real advantage to using this is that if I move this control into another container, it will automatically pick up the height or width from its parent. In fact, you can use that parent dot property to grab information about that parent that you're within. So if you want to grab a different color, or if you wanted to grab a value, you could do that with the parent dot property value as well. It's not just limited to the height and the width. And again, we'll show that off in a little bit of time. We can also nest containers within each other. So when we start using these height and vertical and horizontal containers, we can actually nest them within each other as well to kind of build a behavior. That's what we're trying to build with these apps, a behavior on how it presents that information as well. Now, it can get a little bit confusing as to what's going on, and so what I would recommend doing is using labels to actually figure out exactly what's going on. So I will be using a few labels to kind of show you the height and width of my Power App in a few seconds. And just as always, there is a significant amount of documentation on the Microsoft Docs website. Again, I'm going to grab that link and I'll put that into the share area a little bit later on. Let's have a quick look. So someone's asked if there's any cost of responsive design. So is it reduced in speed? Typically, no. Responsive design is actually it's something that's handled by Powerapps very, very well. and so no, there's no impact on the overall speed. In fact, most of the impact on an app's loading time or an app's rendering time can actually come down mainly down to the Powerapps data source, how often you're checking for updates, what type of functions you're using to grab that information, etc. Whether or not you're using collections and variables to store that information. So if you are interested in reducing the delay, the latency of your app, there is a tool within Powerapps called Monitor that helps you kind of monitor where your Powerapps are spending a lot of time. But in terms of performance, no, because this calculation is done within the app, there's no impact on the actual speed. And as you can see, when I am simply dragging and changing the screen size, it's dynamically changing. It's waiting for me to stop, admittedly, before it makes that change. It's not doing it constantly, it's doing it periodically as I pause on the screen size adjustment before it's making its adjustments. And as you can see, it does that nice and quickly and easy because it's not referencing back to that data source every single time. Now, on that note, that's actually a kind of a great point. Always test. Whenever you're making changes to your Powerapps, whether you're making them responsive or incorporating new features and functions, it's always worth testing on every type of device that you can get your hands on as well. So it's great having my experience that I have here. I've got fast internet, I've got a fast computer, I'm the only person using the app at the time. I'm obviously going to get the best experience. It's always worth testing on the end user's device where at all possible. So even with this in mind, test every single scenario that you can come up with for your Power App. So as I said, this is my Power App that's using the horizontal and vertical containers, but let's have a quick look at how they work in the real world. So over here on the left-hand side, I've got some containers already set up for us to have a quick look at. So if I just quickly zoom in, if I open up my tree view and open up the screen that we're on, we've actually got two of the containers on here as well. We've got the vertical and we've got the horizontal containers laid out, and I can select those just like I could any other item on our tree view, and I can open these up again. So just like we can with galleries and forms, we can nest items within our containers as well. And as you can see on this one, I've actually nested another type of container within another container as well. So again, you can nest multiple containers within each other to get the best experience. So if I select container number 2, which is this container at the top, it's as easy as going to the insert icon, typing in the word container, and then there are our two new options that have been added into Powerapps for us to use. And I can simply click on those to add them into my screen. Now, one thing to note, that when adding in items to our container, what we'll need to do is make sure that we have the container selected in order to add an item into it. So for example, if I wanted to add in button number 5 to my container here, and I don't have it selected, what would happen is the button would be entered into the screen. So it would still be in the tree view, but it wouldn't be entered into the actual container itself. And so all I could do here is bring to the front or send it to the back. I can reorder it, but I can't actually put it into this container. Now I could cut and copy, or I could copy and paste. I could select my container, so I've got it selected in my tree view, and then I could paste that in, or I could use the menus to insert that. But now it's inserted my button. But notice it didn't just put it onto the screen. So if I was to insert multiple buttons, it just drops them onto the screen. It's expecting me to worry about the position of that new item. But when I put them into one of the new containers, it automatically knows that the layout is going to be in a certain way. It knows that I want these items to appear either next to each other or on top of each other. In this case, I've got the horizontal container set up. Now, just to make it easier, I'm going to change this button's name to button number 5, if it will let me. There we go, button number 5, so we know which buttons are where. And with the container selected, we've got our new properties area just here. Now this will allow us to determine how our container will behave, how the controls within our container will then behave. So we can actually change from a horizontal to a vertical. So it doesn't matter whether or not we have inserted the right item from our menu. We can actually switch between the container layouts from the actual direction of our container, from its properties. Now, depending on which one we have selected is obviously going to depend on how we justify and how we align our items within our container. So depending on the scenario, if you want this to be maybe a side menu or a top menu, or just an array of options for your users to interact with, as you can see, I can adjust the height and the width of these items, but the items themselves are they're hidden, they're disappearing from view. Now what we can do with these is we can choose how we want to lay the items out. So if I wanted to justify them in the middle, it's now it's justified the items to appear in the middle, but we're still cutting off the ends of our buttons. So although I can still interact with these buttons, if I was to play the screen, I can still interact with these buttons. I've actually lost the edge of each one, so that's not ideal. What we can also then do as well is how we are aligning our items vertically. So this is how they're going to appear from the center of our container. So if I simply select the center option, it's going to then center them to the middle of the container. So if the container grows, they're going to remain in the middle. If the container shrinks, again, they're going to be contained within the middle. One of the biggest issues I've always experienced with Powerapps is the consistency of laying items out. I just want to put a new option onto the screen and have it appear at the end of the list. I know where it's going, but Powerapps always seems to struggle with this. So this is a much easier approach to adding in a new option or adding in a new navigation function or button or etc. So depending on which layout options that we select here will depend upon how those options are going to be displayed. But again, I'm still cutting off the end of my buttons here. Now we also have an option, if I just change this to the top and the center, we can also specify the gap. Now this is the space in between our buttons. So again, it makes the buttons appear aesthetically better. However, it's still cutting off the buttons themselves. Fortunately, we've got three different options available to us here. We've got overflow and we've got wrap. If I was to switch wrap on, essentially what it would do is it would recognize that this button is not visible and it would wrap that option round. And so as I increase or decrease the container, it's then going to wrap those options to appear in the available space. Apologies there. So again, we've still lost a button there though because my container is so small. This is where the overflow options can come into play as well. So if we just switch that off, make that a little bit bigger. Essentially what we can do is we can specify whether or not we have a scroll bar for this area. So I can put on a horizontal scroll and I can even put on a vertical scroll as well. So if we put on the vertical scroll, that's obviously not ideal. So it all depends on the scenario and what you're trying to achieve with the container that you're using. So it's not ideal to have a scroll bar within a scroll bar. But these containers basically make it easier for us to quickly and easily lay out controls. Now note that I can't drag an item. So I've just tried to drag an item there and it says to move this control using the tree view or with the arrow key. So if I wanted to put button 4 into a new position, what I'd actually need to do is go over to the tree view, click on the ellipses and then go to reorder. Notice that the options now not move to front, not push to back, not forwards, backwards, that they're moved left and right. It's also understanding the direction in which these options are being displayed. And if I change the direction for our container as well, and then go down to button number 4, notice it now says up and down. And I can reorder these so that button number 4 appears in a different position. So I don't drag and drop these options, I actually move the controls in the tree view as well. So these properties that we've been given are to control all of the controls within that container, the container itself. However, if I was to select an individual control as well, we also have on a singular control a couple of new items available to us. So we've got a line in container, which we can set to custom, or we can set to set by container. Essentially, when we say set by container, we're saying, oh, grab all of the controls from the parent being the container that it's in. I can then specify whether this option displays differently, or if I select flexible height, what this means is it's actually going to take up available space where it's not occupied by something else. So with this available space, what we're given then is two other additional options. Now, what we need to worry about when we're using responsive design is how things look at both ends of the spectrum. How things look when they're the smallest and how things look when they are biggest. So just go under the question pop in there. Let's have a quick look at what that says there. I'll answer that question in a short time. Sorry about that. So yeah, we're basically saying I can override the available space that's available, and basically go, right, I want to occupy all of this space with my controls. I don't want them to leave any white space available. And again, depending on how the actual container then goes on to appear, will depend on how that will then behave. So, and again, we can set that to multiple devices, controls as well. Notice that this time it's not taking up quite as much space as button number 5. But what we've also got is portions. Now, what these portions do is essentially they divide up the available space. This is a way for us to control how much space a singular control is actually going to occupy within our existing control. So by default it's set to 1 of 2, but what I can essentially do is say 5, and it will recalculate and it will give more precedence to this control. So this control is actually using 5 of 6 available portions. This control is using 1, and all of the other controls are using 1 as well. And essentially what this portion control will allow us to do, if we change our control back to a horizontal, is notice that the button number 2 is also taking up additional space now as a result. So button number 2 and button number 5 are using additional space based upon that option. Now, these options are useful for occupying all the available space. They're useful for making sure that that button, regardless of how wide or how narrow that screen is going to be, I'm going to make the best use of my screen. So what can we do with these controls? How can we use them to kind of resize our screen? This is all good stuff, but how does this help me build a responsive app? This is where my screen size screen comes in. So on this screen, what I've got is an icon to help me navigate back on the mobile app that we'll look at in a minute, a title, and then I've also got a vertical container. So within this vertical container, I've got a number of labels, and on these labels, I'm essentially referencing to all of those items that we referenced in our some useful items screen there. So essentially on my height label, what I'm referencing is the screen.height. So I'm referencing the screen's name, which is screen size.height. I'm then referencing the width, and then I'm calculating the screen size. So remember when I asked for the screen size, I'm basically saying based upon the screen size, change the color of the label. So if I preview this option, currently we're at screen size 4, and if we go back to the PowerPoint quickly, that is a desktop computer, so it's correctly identified that I'm on a wide screen. So it knows that I'm on a desktop computer with that. However, what we can then do is resize the screen. So if I just drag the screen in, notice that it's changing color now. So it's recognized, oh, this is the same size as a tablet would be in the horizontal position. If I continue to resize, I then get screen size 2, which is orange in my case. And again, further down, notice I can't go any narrower. That's just the restriction of the browser. It's then picked up that I'm on screen size 1. So with a combination of these properties and these control options, what we're able to do is build an app that can respond to the change in its surroundings. Now, fortunately for ourselves, fortunately for me, the way they've recently done a change to the way the preview works, and we're able to see that live. As we're making changes, the preview now changes as well. So that's a big advantage to how it used to work. We used to have to save and publish our apps in order to see these changes, but now the preview actually responds with us on that. But let's just have a look at exactly the same app on exactly the same screen on my mobile device as well. So just to prove that this kind of works, at the top of the screen I've put in a couple of symbols. One of those is the screen size, and as you can see straight away it's detected that I'm actually on screen size 1. And so remember, screen size 1 was the small screen, and it's the phone device. Let me just see if I can get my orientation switched on. Let's see what impact that will actually have. So I've now gone into my orientation. I've rotated it 90 degrees, and it's now picked up that my app is screen size 3 because it's picked up the width of my screen. Now notice that I've also got container height and container width in here as well, and that is the container that we're in currently. That is the container that we're contained in. That is our, I believe it's a horizontal container, and basically what I'm doing here is I'm taking the container's height and the container's width as well, and this is using the parent reference that we're talking about on this screen. So here I was talking about referencing to the parent value, and again that is because we are nested. So because our items are nested within the container, if I was to change my container's layout, all of my options would appear in a different layout, and I could choose to wrap those so that I could see them all on the screen at the same time. Notice that as I am changing the width and the height of my container, the screen size and the screen width isn't changing, but the container's height and width is. That's because if we just quickly look at the text value of my control, it's doing container width as a string and then the parent dot width. So it's actually taking the width of its parent, which is the container. Now just to kind of prove what that's doing, if I copy that, select my screen and paste that onto the screen, my parent, which is now the screen itself, so the item directly above it, is taking the width. As we know, it's the screen's width. Now all of that comes together. We need to use all of these options together to be able to convert our app into a responsive design app. So if I quickly open up my my parking screen again, the one we saw earlier on, the initial screen, essentially what we've got going on here, if we open it all up, is we've got a screen container, one screen container that's going around everything. This is a vertical container. Now this was actually created using the new screen layouts that we have available. So we've got split screen, sidebar, and header, main, section, and footer. So this is the option that I used. I just simply didn't need the footer, so I removed that option. And essentially, when creating a screen using this layout, we use the nested properties. So I've got two containers here nested inside a larger one, and this initial container, remember, is laying things out vertically, so it's stacking the containers on top of each other. So my header container is here and my vertical container is here. Now because of that, because it's stacking them on top of each other, it does not matter how wide my screen is, remember, because it's using those properties that we saw for the button to reorder everything, to make everything fit by giving it its own space on the screen. So if we recreate, let's go new screen, let's go main header and footer. It's automatically entered in my initial container as it's highlighted here, and opening up, it's actually giving me a header container, a main section container, and then a footer container as well. So we can now add controls into these containers, and they're automatically going to be distributed based upon the properties that we've got available here. So if I just quickly go back to my parking screen, so for my header container, what I've actually got in here is 3 controls. I've got icon 1, icon 2, and then label number 7. Now what icon 1 has got set to it is I don't have the flexible width. All I've got is a width. So I don't need it to be any bigger or smaller. That is okay to stay at its height and width. So when I was looking at it on my mobile device, we'll just quickly load that back up on the screen. Notice how big those icons are in comparison to the rest of the actual. Oh, let's get rid of that. Of the actual screen, because it's set at that height and width. Whereas when I display them on my preview button, they appear as they are. They don't increase, they don't decrease as things increase or decrease. Now, one problem that I was running into with my Power App was that the visitor parking log label was too big. It was overlapping the 2 items. So it all jumbled together. They all still worked, but it didn't look great. So let's have a quick look at that as it was. So if we go to my visitor parking log, and if I just take this out briefly and put in the size, which is 25, everything looks great up until I start to make it smaller. What was happening on my mobile device was this was overlapping my 2 controls because it was taking up too much space. So what I had to do was, with my label selected on the size property, is I did a calculation. So if my parking screen dot size is 1, or I could also have done small, which, as we know, is my mobile device. So if I go over to my mobile device and click on the right screen, there it is. We know that that's screen size 1. If my screen size is 1, there we go, let's go with that. Then set my my size of my text to 12. It just meant that it was slightly smaller and that it appears on the screen correctly. And that is it's basic. That is how we build our responsive apps. We use this screen size value. So we look at our screen size and we look at that value, and essentially we base our calculations on that. So back to the question about is there any performance penalties for this? No, because it's just a recalculation using information the app already has. It doesn't have to go off and kind of retrieve information from our data source or anything like that. Now, if we look at our container options for the header container, what we've got set up here is our justification is set to center. So it's setting everything to the center, but you might think, well, hang on a minute, everything that isn't in the center, everything's off to the left. Now that's because if I go into my label and scroll down, my fixed width has been set to a minimum of 150. So it doesn't matter how big the screen is going to be, my minimum width is always going to be 150. So it's taking up the large proportion of that screen. It's taking up one of one portions. It's taking up all of the screen, essentially. We don't have the flexible width on the icons or on either of the icons. And so because we have the flexible width set to 1 of 1, if I was to switch that on for the 2 icons, notice that immediately they have a distribution. It equalizes the amount of space that they're taking up. So if I was to kind of rectify this without switching off the flexible width, what I could do is say, instead of 1 of 3 portions, I could give it 4 of 6 portions. Or I could even increase that. I could even say 10. And what that's going to do is basically divide that space by 12, and then allocate 10 of those portions to that. Obviously, it's much easier in this case just to leave it at 1 and then switch off flexible width. But that's how flexible width can help you take up less space with certain items as well. So now moving on to the main section, let's collapse this a little bit more so we can see what's going on. In our main section, what I've actually got is a gallery on the left and a form on the right. And with my form, essentially, we're looking at the same data source, so it makes things nice and simple. Whenever an item is selected in my gallery, it simply updates the form. It goes and grabs the information from that item in my SharePoint list and updates it with that information. Now, these items are actually quite responsive on their own, but because the container, the parent that they were in, doesn't respond, they've had no use, they've had no need to. That's why using galleries and forms with our containers is really, really useful, because they already have the elements for responsive design set up already. Notice that with my in my preview mode, that as I increase and decrease the screen, the form reconfigures down from 3 or 4 columns into 2 or even into 1. Now that's actually an option built into the form itself. I don't need to worry about setting up too much for the form. So if I just select my form control and go into the form's layout options, we've got snap to columns. I've got that switched on. I've got this set to 4, and I've also got my layout set to vertical. I could set this to horizontal if I wanted to. I could choose the layout that best suits how the app is going to work. And again, there's going to be scenarios where we end up like this, where there's a bit of a gap. We can do calculations here on our number of columns. So if we go to our widths, etc. So what else can we do here? So in my main section, container 2, this is set to horizontal. My justification is set to the start, so that's on the left, and vertical to the start again. So again, everything is happening from that central position of the container. Which direction are you aligning things from? That's essentially where the justification kind of comes in. Again, we can set a gap if we really wanted to make things laid out a little bit better. So there's a bit of a gap there. I don't know if you can quite make that out. Yeah, just there in the middle. Obviously, in this case, that doesn't make any sense. Now, what was actually happening with my Power App when I was using it on a mobile device for my gallery is because I was having it in a horizontal direction for my container on my mobile phone device. What was actually happening was, if we go back to the home screen to kind of show this off, is notice that the actual mobile phone layout, I now have my gallery on top, which I can scroll through here, and my form is then at the bottom. Now, the way I achieve this, because remember we're using a horizontal layout, not a vertical. What was actually happening is I would end up with a gallery that was never ending, because in fact, let's just kind of show it as it was. Because it was essentially not sure how long it needed to be. So what we had to do to kind of correct that is, again, I had to refer to the screen size. Now you can do this in a couple of ways. You could use a switch function, or you could do what I've done here, which is use an if function. Let's put it into the formula bar to make it easier to see and to use. Essentially what I'm doing is I'm using an if function to determine the height of my control. So if I take this out, so I copy that out and kind of replace how it was, so you can get a better understanding of what I'm trying to say. So from this view, nothing seems to have changed. I can still interact with items, etc., etc. But as I made my app smaller, remember this is what I wanted to see with the form at the bottom and the gallery at the top. I'm not seeing that. I've got this never-ending scroll, and I don't actually see the form, and that's because there's no correct height for my my gallery control. So this is where test comes in. Always make sure you test every little scenario whenever you're making changes, and this is also where the labeling comes in as well. So my screen size controls that we've got here, let's put that back so it looks a little bit nicer. Remember, I was referencing the parent. I can also reference there it is, parent.height. I can also reference directly a singular control so that I can see information about it. But if I go back to my parking screen and select my gallery again, and we've already got height selected fortunately, what I did is I put in a function here that basically says if the parking screen size is small, then set the container's height to the height of the screen divided by 2. So I'm actually halving the amount of screen height that I have available by 2, so that I'm now manually setting the height of my container to what we see on my my Power App here. So I've cut the screen in half essentially. Now what I also need to do and make sure that I'm doing while I'm here is I also need to minus off my my header container height. So that is called header container 2. So header container 2 dot height. Let's put that in, and again makes no changes to this mode because remember that if statement was if when the screen size is 1. So if we open this up, so currently we're on screen size 4. If I scroll this across, now I'm on screen size 1. Move back. Now I've got a bit of a gap at the bottom because it's taken that height calculation off. But it means I can still interact with my form. And again, I'll need to make sure I have that value. Where is that? On my form as well. So if we go to my form's height, I'll need to make sure I put that same calculation in there as well. And yeah, which I already have. And then that's how. Again, it's not impacting this mode because when we press play and we go over to the view screen, we're in number 4. So my if statement isn't picking up that option. So there is no golden rule with this other than try and remember that parent value, so that parent height, etc. that we've got going on here. Definitely utilize the size value as well of your screen, so that if you do run into a scenario where, just like on our mobile app that we were seeing a moment ago, if you run into a scenario where the one of the items isn't displaying, you need to put an override in. That's essentially what you're doing. You're building an override in. So the actual responsive nature of the containers is very useful. We can use our containers to lay out our controls, and as the containers change size and width and height, etc., the controls move around. We're basically leveraging that ability, and especially if we use the new screen option, there it is, screen 1, by building initially a container. So it all starts with this container that we use. Select your container, place all of your controls within inside the container, then you're able to then build upon that to have your responsive design layout. And again, you can nest these controls within inside of each other. I believe you can go up to 5 levels. Don't quote me on that one, I'll find that one out. But yeah, I think you can go up to 5 levels before you start running into any issues. But with these containers in place, then with their properties and the parent dot height and width references, you can quickly and easily build your Power App to be responsive. So that went a little bit longer than I was expecting, admittedly, but hopefully you got lots of information from out of that. This video will also be available on YouTube as well. There was a question that came in about the is there anything known about its future limited availability? There's nothing in the remit at the minute. So someone's asked, because it's in preview, is there anything on the roadmap? There isn't anything on the roadmap at the minute as to when this is going to go into GA. However, it has had a few changes implemented in the last few months. So the ability for the preview of our Powerapps to resize our apps as well has come in, and also the actual containers themselves are relatively new as well. We could do the responsive designs before, but there was a lot more manual calculations going on. So these new containers make things much easier. So I don't expect it to be too long before these are kind of what we'll actually have available out of the box.